If you've ever tried learning Chinese, you've probably hit this dilemma. Should I learn simplified Chinese characters or traditional Chinese characters? Simplified is used in mainland China, Singapore, and Malaysia, while traditional is used in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. But let's be honest, the name here is very suggestive. One is literally called simplified. That must mean it's easier to learn, right? Well, let's take a look at why there are two Chinese writing systems in the first place. Essentially, after China overthrew the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century, there were various voices urging the government to make reading and writing simpler. After all, during the dynastical rule, the vast majority of Chinese people could not read or write, and the complex writing system likely played a big role in this. There were efforts to simplify Chinese characters during nationalist rule, but due to conservative leaders' opposition, these never came to fruition. Only after the communists came to power did character simplification become a reality. In the 1950s and 60s, China simplified over 2,200 characters, reducing strokes, merging related or similar sounding forms, and standardized writing. Take a look at a few examples. The character for study or school, 16 strokes were reduced to 8. The character for dragon, 16 strokes were reduced to 5. And the character for body, 23 strokes were reduced to just 7. This last one in particular is a huge reduction, removing almost 70% of the total number of strokes. The logic of simplification was straightforward. Make characters less complicated by reducing strokes, and they'll be easier to learn, read, and write. And that makes logical sense. Before 1949, China's literacy rate was often said to be under 20%. Since there were no national standards for measuring it, the exact number is unknown, but it's certain that literacy was very low. Fast forward to 2020, and the literacy rate is up to around 97%, according to the World Bank and UNESCO. But is it really the simplified characters that did the trick? After all, literacy rates in Taiwan and Hong Kong, which use traditional characters, are also very high, so we can't make conclusions based on literacy rates. We have to dig deeper. Okay, this is actually perfect timing because, spoiler alert, I read a ridiculous amount of PDFs when researching these videos. I am constantly going through academic papers, scrolling through 100-page documents trying to find just one useful paragraph. Which is why I've been using UPDF lately. The UX and UI are a big reason. Compared to tools like Adobe Acrobat, it just feels a lot more like how I'd expect a modern PDF app to work. However, its AI functionality is what really sets it apart. It uses models like GPT-5 and DeepSeek, so even when a document is 100 pages long, I can chat with it, get a quick summary, or even in-depth explanations on things I don't quite understand. Plus, it just got a major update this month with even more useful tools like AI Bookmark Agent, which instantly generates smart document navigation, and AI Semantic Search, which totally transforms the search function. It can find relevant sections even if you don't remember the specific keywords. Of course, it handles everything you normally need in a PDF app. Basic text and image editing, filling out forms, editing digital signatures, the works. And the best part, it's about a quarter of the cost of Adobe Acrobat, which is honestly kind of ridiculous for how much it does. So if any part of your workflow is working with PDFs, you've got to check out UPDF. You can download it for free, and if you like what you see, go to the link in the description for an exclusive discount just for my viewers. And now, back to the video. First, we need to clarify what simpler characters really mean. Literacy in a language involves at least 3 different skills: writing characters, but also recognizing them visually and understanding their meaning. From the examples we saw before, Simplified Chinese clearly reduces writing effort. Some characters had minimal stroke reduction, but many had drastic stroke reductions. And yes, this makes handwriting faster and less physically demanding. But writing characters is only one part of literacy. Another big part is recognizing and distinguishing between different characters. One argument is that simplifying characters actually makes them harder to tell apart. Why? Because complexity can actually help with visual distinction. In English, for example, ideas of varying complexity are made up of morphemes of varying lengths. However, in Chinese, we're stuck with a square grid. That's all the space you get. So when we have more complicated ideas to express, we're forced to crowd the square grid, making it more and more visually complex. In fact, a 2018 study by L.Y. Chang and colleagues compared 131 writing systems and found that Chinese characters rank as the most visually complex script. Congrats to us! We have the most complex writing system in the world. We win!
Yay!
In actuality, because of the space limitations of our morphemes, the Chinese script works so well because it is visually complex. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to differentiate different morphemes. Compare these traditional characters: Guang, meaning wide, and Chang, meaning factory. They're visually rich and structurally different. There are several different places that tell us that they're different characters. Now, look at their simplified forms. These are much simpler, much easier to write and remember the strokes for. But at the same time, they're also much more similar to each other, with only one stroke difference, which might make them more difficult to tell apart. Or take the example of fa to emit and fa, hair. In traditional Chinese, we can very much see that they're different characters with unrelated meanings. Their only commonality is their pronunciation, fa, albeit in different tone contours. In Simplified Chinese, they both became this character. Yes, the two characters are now easier to write, but they're now morphemically and phonetically ambiguous, which sort of defeats the whole purpose of Chinese characters. As we know, Chinese characters are efficient in the way they encode morphemes. Ideally, one character would correspond to one morpheme and one sound, but unfortunately, that isn't the case, even before simplification happened. For example, this character, which hasn't been simplified, look at it. It doesn't need to be. It has several different meanings and correspondingly several different pronunciations. Simplifying characters definitely exacerbated this problem by adding a lot more characters to its ranks. So while simplification made each character easier to write on an individual level, on a whole, the system may become more visually ambiguous, more dependent on context, and thus less informative at the character level. For example, when simplified readers see this character, they don't know which fa or fa it's referring to. They'd have to look at the context. If it comes before song, as in fa song, send, we know it means fa emit. And if it comes before xing, as in fa xing, hairstyle, we know it means fa or hair. But here's where things get interesting. Some research suggests that because of the reduced visual complexity in simplified characters, its readers actually develop stronger visual processing skills. A 2005 study by McBride Chang and colleagues explored how children's visual processing skills relate to learning Chinese characters. They followed two groups of kindergarteners for a year: 118 children in Hong Kong learning traditional Chinese, and 96 children in Xiangtan, Hunan, learning simplified Chinese. And both groups were tested on several visual skills, including visual spatial relationships, visual discrimination, and visual closure. The key finding was that visual spatial relationships were the strongest predictor of Chinese character recognition, which suggests that the ability to perceive the direction of how radicals are arranged is especially critical for learning characters. Crucially, they found that children learning simplified Chinese characters consistently perform better on all visual tasks compared to those learning traditional Chinese. Another study in 2018 by Yang and Wang tested adults of similar backgrounds, university students in Beijing and Hong Kong. Participants were asked to judge minimal pair characters, characters that differ from each other in only one stroke. These minimal pair characters were modified to create gradient characters that gradually morph from one form to another. The study tested when the Beijing and Hong Kong students would perceive that one character had changed into the other. The results showed that Simplified Chinese readers were able to discriminate the gradient characters with more accuracy compared to the traditional readers, which led the researchers to conclude that simplified readers have stronger sensitivity to fine visual differences. Together, these studies show that experience with simplified Chinese characters is associated with better visual spatial skills and stronger performance on visual discrimination tasks. But why would that be the case? One idea is that because simplified characters are less visually distinctive, readers are forced to rely on finer visual cues. For example, distinguishing between Wang and Chang, Jin and Yi. The differences in these characters are subtle, so instead of the system making the characters simple to differentiate, one's brain adapts and becomes better at spotting those differences. Now let's talk about learning. At first glance, fewer strokes should make characters easier to learn, but as a writing system, there's a lot more that plays into it. It's said that the average proficient Chinese adult knows about 6,000 to 8,000 characters, all of which are different in structure, meaning, and pronunciation. You might wonder, how does one do that? Well, even though we Chinese people love tradition, we're also very efficient. So we've developed a way to make the job easier for us, something we call semantic phonetic characters. Over 80% of Chinese characters fall in this category. Essentially, a character is made up of two or more components, what we call radicals. One radical indicates the general meaning, and the other provides a hint about the pronunciation. When I say hint, I would say the sound radical is helpful about 2/3 of the time, but not a vast majority of the time. However, this 2/3 help is pretty good. That means a Chinese person can look at a character they've never seen before and correctly guess the pronunciation about 2/3 of the time. Simplified characters actually upgraded the usefulness of the phonetic radical in some instances. For example, in the character for tai, meaning form, the phonetic radical 能 changed sound over time, leading to what I like to call a dead phonetic radical, which means it no longer helps us figure out the pronunciation. When simplifying the character, the dead phonetic radical was replaced by tai, a character that actually has the same pronunciation of the target character today. This simplification is what I would call a win-win, easier to write and easier to remember. However, in other instances, simplifying led to decreased phonetic connections between characters. For example, the original character for allow, 让, consists of a semantic radical yan on the left and the phonetic radical xiang on the right. Although xiang doesn't sound too much like the word 让, that radical is relatively consistent in other characters it's in, like 让 meaning pulp, 壤 meaning soil, and 囊 meaning bag. Simplifying a commonly used character like 让 to 让 is great for making it easier to write, but it makes characters with the same sound radical that much more difficult to remember. But have these decreased phonetic connections led to problems for simplified Chinese readers? Is it harder for them to learn and memorize more characters? A recent study seems to suggest otherwise. A large-scale 2024 study compared simplified and traditional Chinese readers to examine how the two systems affect reading, writing, and vocabulary. The study included 486 university students from mainland China and 354 from Hong Kong, all with similarly self-rated Chinese proficiency. To measure writing ability and vocabulary knowledge, participants completed a dictation test in which they heard the same words but in their native tongue and wrote them down exactly in simplified for Chinese participants and in traditional for Hong Kong participants. And scoring was strict. only perfectly written characters were counted. Despite similar self-assessments, Simplified Chinese readers performed significantly better, scoring about 83.4% correct compared to 70.4% correct for traditional readers. The authors interpret dictation performance as reflecting vocabulary knowledge, and they argue that the advantage for simplified readers likely comes from the reduced burden of writing. Because they are quicker and easier to write, learners may be able to practice and learn more words over time, leading to a stronger vocabulary. In other words, simplification seems to lower the barrier to producing written language, which can support literacy growth, even if it shifts some of the difficulty to visual processing during reading. One thing I think we can say for sure is that although simplified characters look simpler at first glance, they're not necessarily simpler when viewed holistically as a writing system. It's arguably more ambiguous. However, the real surprise is that although the writing system is more ambiguous, simplified Chinese readers have somehow flipped the problem on its head and emerged stronger from it. There's quite a lot of research showing that simplified Chinese readers have stronger visual discrimination skills, so I think this is now a widely accepted phenomenon within the academic community. However, the research on the vocabulary size cannot be viewed as conclusive. This particular study on traditional readers was done in Hong Kong, where simultaneous education in Cantonese, Mandarin, and English may play a role in reducing the amount of characters participants were able to recall and write down correctly. A good follow-up would be to do it in Taiwan, where the Mandarin education is comparable to that in mainland China. A big thanks goes out to the researchers I've mentioned in this video. Before scientific research was conducted on processing simplified characters, there was no verifiable way to know if it really did improve literacy or helped comprehension and learning. All in all, I think both simplified and traditional characters have their merit. Traditional characters obviously have the morphemic high ground. They're more semantically transparent, which helps with recognition and understanding. On the other hand, simplified characters are undoubtedly easier to write, and there is a possibility that it leads to a bigger vocabulary, as remembering a character's visual form is heavily dependent on writing it. I grew up with simplified, and when I first moved to Hong Kong about 7 years back, I struggled with some of the traditional characters. They didn't look right to me. They're just not the way that I feel like they should look. But I think that whatever set of characters you grew up with, those are the ones that are going to look right to you. Similarly, Taiwanese and Hong Kongers, when they travel to mainland China, they'll probably look at simplified characters and feel that there's something off about them. If you ask my honest opinion, I think even if mainland China didn't simplify characters, we would have been fine. We would have still improved literacy rates. But one thing I think we can't argue with, people still would have found ways to simplify writing characters in everyday life, just like they still do in Taiwan and Hong Kong now. Because let's be real, nobody wants to be writing 32 strokes when they can just write 6. I mean, that's just human nature. Thanks again for watching. Let me know in the comments what surprised you the most about today's video, and see you next time. Bye.